Picture a map so valuable it could decide the fate of kingdoms, a single sheet of parchment holding the power to guide thousands through trackless deserts, over treacherous mountain ranges, and straight into lands Europeans had only ever dreamed of. This wasn't just navigation, it was high-stakes artistry fused with mathematical genius. In the age of the Crusades, maps were guarded like royal jewels, and the cartographers who made them were far more than simple scribes. They were pioneers, blending celestial observation, sacred geometry, and raw courage to illuminate a world that, to most, was shrouded in mystery and danger. These visionaries didn't just draw coastlines or sketch rivers, they calculated their way across continents using tools and techniques that feel astonishingly advanced even today. With little more than an astrolabe, some trigonometric principles, and fragments of knowledge exchanged between cultures, they transformed vast unknowns into structured, navigable reality. Every measurement was an act of faith in science, in God, and in human curiosity. Their work supported everything from holy pilgrimages to military campaigns, turning speculation into strategy and fear into foresight. What's truly remarkable is how much of their innovation still echoes in the way we map our world now, from satellite imaging to digital geolocation. So why journey back with us into this intricate past? Because hidden within these ancient lines and calculations are stories of perseverance, intellect, and breathtaking ambition. Stories that redefine what it means to explore. Over the course of this video, we'll uncover how these Crusader cartographers used astronomy to anchor their charts in the stars, how they borrowed and blended knowledge from Islamic and classical scholars, and how they faced down unimaginable obstacles to bring clarity to the chaos of unknown lands. This is a tale of human ingenuity at its most daring, and it all begins with a blank piece of parchment and a question: how do you map what you cannot see? Before the Crusades, Europe's understanding of the world beyond its borders was a patchwork of myth, fragmented classical knowledge, and sketchy pilgrim reports. Maps, if they existed at all, were often more symbolic than practical, beautifully illustrated diagrams showing Jerusalem at the center of the world, but offering little guidance for actually getting there. This all changed with Pope Urban II's call to arms in 1095. Suddenly, thousands of knights, foot soldiers, and devout pilgrims were streaming eastward, driven by faith, ambition, or the promise of land, into a region they knew almost nothing about. The Levant, with its sprawling deserts, rugged mountain passes, and complex coastlines, was a terrifying and disorienting puzzle. Getting lost wasn't just an inconvenience, it could mean death from thirst, ambush, or simply vanishing into the vastness. This desperate, immediate need to move armies and supply lines across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar terrain is what sparked the dawn of Crusader cartography. It was no longer enough to know the world was round. They needed to know how many days' march it was from Antioch to Jerusalem, where to find fresh water in the Judean desert, and the most defensible routes through the Taurus mountains. Out of this chaos emerged a new kind of intellectual hero, the Crusader cartographer. These were not adventurers charting new worlds for glory, but often quiet, scholarly figures, monks, clerks, or university-trained scholars attached to the courts of kings and nobles. Their scriptoriums were their workshops, but their raw material was not just parchment and ink, but a volatile mix of anxiety, ambition, and urgent necessity. They were tasked with an almost impossible mission: to create order from the unknown. They began by collating every piece of information they could find. They interviewed returning pilgrims, merchants who had braved the Silk Road, and even captured soldiers, piecing together fragments of description into a coherent whole. But they quickly realized that stories and sketches were not enough. To create maps that could be trusted with lives and campaigns, they needed something more reliable, something objective. This is where the fusion of minds began. They started applying the rigorous principles of Euclidean geometry, a science preserved and advanced in the very Islamic libraries they now had access to these travelers' tales. They used trigonometry to calculate distances between points described in accounts, creating a skeletal framework of triangles across the landscape. This marriage of qualitative anecdote and quantitative calculation was their first great innovation. This work was far from purely academic. A map created in a scriptorium in Acre or Jerusalem could directly influence the outcome of a siege or the success of a supply caravan. An accurately charted mountain pass could allow a Crusader force to surprise an enemy. An incorrectly estimated distance could strand an entire company in the desert. The pressure on these mapmakers was immense. Their creations became strategic assets, closely guarded and highly prized. But beyond the immediate military application, their work represented a profound shift in thinking. They were applying a nascent, almost Renaissance-style empiricism, a belief that the world could be understood through measurement, observation, and reason, to a deeply medieval, faith-driven endeavor. They were drawing the lines of the earth to serve the will of heaven. This unique position, straddling the worlds of faith and reason, of European tradition and Eastern knowledge, made them the unsung architects of not just routes, but of a new way of seeing the world. Their maps were the blueprints upon which the fate of empires turned, and they built them not with compasses and chains, but with mathematics, courage, and an unwavering determination to light a lamp in the overwhelming darkness of the unknown. Armed with the urgent need to chart a path through foreign lands, these Crusader mapmakers turned to the most reliable language they knew, the universal language of mathematics. At the heart of their craft lay geometry, a science preserved from the ancient Greeks and now being rediscovered with fresh intensity. Think of the landscape they faced, a series of unknown points, a distant mountain, a reported oasis, a coastal city. Their genius was in connecting these dots not with guesswork, but with the unwavering logic of triangles and circles. If a returning pilgrim said it took 3 days to walk from point A to point B, the cartographer couldn't just draw a line. They had to translate that time into a measurable distance. By assuming an average pace for a traveler or a marching soldier, they could estimate the length of that leg of the journey. Then, using a second report from a different direction, they could construct a triangle. The principles of similar triangles and the Pythagorean theorem allowed them to calculate the direct, straight-line distance between 2 points they might never have seen themselves, creating a precise spatial relationship on the page. This process of triangulation was their foundational magic trick, turning vague descriptions into quantifiable facts. But the land was not flat, and this is where their innovation truly soared. Simple distance wasn't enough. They needed to understand the lay of the land, the steepness of a hill, the depth of a valley, the approach to a fortress wall. This is where the budding science of trigonometry came into play. While not yet the formalized field it would become, these scholars understood the basic relationships between the angles and sides of a triangle. Using simple tools like a quadrant or a cross staff, they could measure the angle of elevation to a hilltop or a castle tower. By then measuring the distance to the base of that feature, or even estimating it based on known heights, they could use rudimentary trigonometric calculations to determine its height. This was absolutely critical for military planning. Knowing the height of a wall informed the design of siege towers, Understanding the incline of a pass determined whether a supply wagon could make the climb. They were essentially building a three-dimensional understanding of the world using two-dimensional mathematics, layering elevation data onto their flat maps with remarkable ingenuity. Their workhorse for these angular measurements was often the humble quadrant. This simple quarter-circle device, marked with degrees and fitted with a sighting mechanism, allowed a user to measure the angle between the horizon and a star or a mountain peak. By aligning the quadrant with the pole star, they could even determine their latitude. The real masterpiece of instrumentation, however, was the astrolabe. This intricate device, often called the smartphone of the medieval world, was a complex calculator made of brass. It could tell time, identify stars, and most importantly, calculate altitude. A cartographer would suspend the astrolabe, sight a star through its alidade or pointer, and read the angle from a graduated scale. This celestial data was then translated into earthly position using astronomical tables, many of which were adapted from Arabic Zij or star catalogues. This translation from the observed position of a star in the vastness of space to a fixed point on a parchment map represents one of the most profound intellectual leaps of the era. They were using the clockwork of the heavens to anchor their charts of the Earth. This mathematical rigor was nothing short of revolutionary. Before the Crusades, many European maps were symbolic. The famous T and O maps placed Jerusalem at the center of a circle divided by a T-shaped sea, representing a theological worldview rather than a practical guide. The work of the Crusader cartographers shattered that tradition. They insisted that the representation of the world should be based on observable, measurable, and repeatable calculation. A distance on their map wasn't a guess, it was the product of geometry. A mountain range's portrayal wasn't a decorative squiggle, it was informed by trigonometric estimation. This shift from symbolism to empiricism provided a level of precision that was previously unimaginable in medieval Europe. It transformed the map from an article of faith into a tool of strategy, a document that could be trusted with lives and the outcomes of wars. Their ability to blend abstract, often theoretical mathematics with the gritty, tangible reality of exploration and conquest marks them as true pioneers, laying the groundwork for the scientific revolutions that would follow centuries later. But geometry and trigonometry could only take them so far on a featureless plain or a trackless sea. To truly anchor their maps to the immutable reality of the planet, Crusader cartographers had to look up. The night sky, a dazzling tapestry of stars that had guided sailors and shepherds for millennia, became their most trusted celestial clock and compass. In an age without satellites, astronomy was the ultimate tool for global positioning, and these scholars mastered it with breathtaking sophistication. Their challenge was immense. How do you pinpoint your location on Earth when every dune and valley looks the same? The answer was written in the stars. By meticulously observing the sun, moon, and fixed stars, they could calculate their latitude, their north-south position, with remarkable accuracy. This was the master key that unlocked cross-continental travel, transforming a disorienting journey into a measured, predictable route. The most reliable guide in the Northern Hemisphere was, without a doubt, the pole star Polaris. Unlike other stars that wheel across the sky throughout the night, Polaris holds a nearly fixed position almost directly above the Earth's North Pole. For a Crusader mapmaker standing somewhere in the Levant, this was a gift of cosmic proportions. Using their astrolabe or quadrant, they could measure the angle between the horizon and Polaris. This angle, known as its altitude, directly corresponded to their latitude. If the star appeared 30 degrees above the horizon, they knew they were at approximately 30 degrees north latitude. This simple yet profound measurement allowed them to plot their position along a north-south axis with confidence. It meant a caravan leader could know if he was on the correct parallel to reach Jerusalem, or if he had drifted dangerously off course into hostile territory. The pole star was their constant, unchanging companion in the vastness of the night, a single point of certainty in a world of unknowns. During the day, the sun served a similar purpose, though its path was more complex. To navigate featureless deserts where landmarks shifted with the sands, cartographers and travelers relied on solar readings. By measuring the sun's altitude at its highest point each day, its noon zenith, and consulting astronomical tables, they could again determine their latitude. These tables, known as zaids in the Arabic tradition, were elaborate documents that predicted the positions of the sun, moon, planets, and stars for any given day and time. This is where one of the most fascinating aspects of Crusader cartography comes into focus: the profound exchange of knowledge. The astronomical tables they relied upon were not primarily European inventions. They were the work of brilliant Islamic and earlier Greek scholars. Figures like the Persian astronomer al-Battani, whose meticulous observations refined the understanding of the solar year, or the Greek Claudius Ptolemy, whose Almagest laid the groundwork for mathematical astronomy, were the true architects of this celestial science. Crusader scholars, often working in multicultural cities like Antioch or Tripoli, actively sought out these texts, translating them from Arabic into Latin and adapting their data for their own purposes. They weren't just borrowing, they were integrating a superior system of knowledge into their own worldview. This intellectual synthesis had a dramatic practical benefit. It drastically reduced their reliance on recognizable landmarks. In familiar European terrain, a distinctive hill, a peculiar bend in a river, or a prominent forest could serve as a guide. But in the alien landscapes of the Near East, what looked like a reliable mountain to one traveler might be just one of dozens of identical peaks to another. A river described in spring flood might be a dry wadi by autumn. Celestial navigation cut through this uncertainty. The stars and the sun were not subject to seasonal change, human conflict, or faulty memory. They were the same for everyone, everywhere, offering a democratic and objective standard of measurement. This shift from terrestrial to celestial reference points was a monumental leap in accuracy. It meant a map created in Jerusalem could be reliably used by a pilgrim arriving from Genoa years later, because both could reference the same fixed sky. Ultimately, this astronomical pursuit did more than just create better maps. It built bridges between cultures. In their quest for precision, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars often found common ground in their shared reverence for the heavens. The stars became a neutral territory, a language of mathematics and observation that transcended the religious and political conflicts raging on the ground below. The improved maps that resulted from this collaboration were not just tools for Crusader armies. They also facilitated trade, pilgrimage, and the exchange of ideas along safer, more predictable routes. The legacy of this stellar navigation is etched into our modern world every time a GPS satellite, the direct descendant of these ancient stargazers, calculates a position by locking onto signals from artificial stars in the sky, continuing a quest for location that began centuries ago with a mapmaker looking up, astrolabe in hand, finding his way by the fixed light of the pole star. But this celestial mathematics needed a physical key to unlock its power, and that key was forged in brass and wood. The most sophisticated of these keys was undoubtedly the astrolabe, a device so complex and elegant it stands as a testament to medieval scientific achievement. Imagine a circular disc of metal, often as large as a dinner plate, intricately engraved with a spiderweb of lines, curves, and inscriptions. This was no mere tool, it was a portable analog computer, a model of the universe designed to fit in the palm of your hand. At its heart was a rotating framework called the Rete, which represented the fixed stars and the ecliptic path of the sun. Beneath this, a series of plates were engraved with coordinate lines specific to different latitudes. A user would suspend the astrolabe from a ring, allowing it to hang perfectly vertical. Then, by aligning the sighting bar on the back, called the alidade, with a specific star or the sun, they could read its altitude from a graduated scale on the rim. But the real magic happened next. By turning the Rete to match the observed altitude against the correct latitude plate, the astrolabe could graphically solve a multitude of problems. It could tell the time of day or night, determine the time of sunrise or sunset for any given date, and most crucially for our mapmakers, it provided the precise celestial data needed to calculate their position on Earth. It translated the clockwork motion of the heavens into a fixed, earthly coordinate. For tasks that demanded less complexity but more speed and portability, the quadrant was the instrument of choice. Its design was beautifully simple, a quarter circle of wood or metal marked with a 90-degree scale along its curved edge. A plumb bob hung from the apex of the angle, and a sighting pin was mounted along one straight edge. To measure the altitude of a star, a user would simply sight along the top edge toward the star, and the plumb bob, pulled down by gravity, would indicate the angle on the scale below. Its simplicity made it incredibly robust and accessible. While it couldn't perform the myriad calculations of an astrolabe, it excelled at its primary job, delivering a fast, reliable angular measurement. This made it indispensable for quick checks on the march or for taking a series of rapid readings from a moving ship's deck. Together, the astrolabe and quadrant formed a perfect partnership, one for deep, contemplative calculation in the quiet of a scriptorium, the other for immediate, actionable data in the field. The craftsmanship of these devices was itself a form of science. Master instrument makers, often working in metalsmithing guilds in cities like Constantinople or Palermo, engraved the scales with painstaking precision. A single error in the graduation of a scale could throw off measurements by miles, rendering a map useless or leading an army astray. The engravings were not merely functional. They were often works of art decorated with zodiac symbols, religious motifs, and intricate geometric patterns. This fusion reflected the worldview of the time, the belief that understanding the cosmos was both a scientific and a spiritual pursuit. These weren't just cold, calculating machines. They were objects of beauty that embodied the wonder their users felt for the orderly heavens above. Perhaps the most telling sign of the Crusader cartographers' ingenuity was their willingness to adapt and customize these instruments. They weren't just passive users of technology, they were active improvisers. A standard astrolabe plate engraved for the latitude of Paris, for instance, would be useless in Jerusalem. This necessitated the creation of new plates for new latitudes, a task that required deep understanding and precise calculation. There's also evidence to suggest they began accounting for the magnetic variation between true north and magnetic north, a phenomenon they may have encountered through discrepancies between their compass readings and their celestial observations. This practical problem-solving, this willingness to tweak and adjust their most sophisticated tools, highlights a truly hands-on genius. They were bridging the gap between theoretical knowledge, often inherited from ancient texts, and the messy, unpredictable reality of the physical world. Every customized astrolabe plate, every adjusted sighting mechanism, was a step toward greater accuracy, turning abstract mathematical principles into life-saving, actionable data that could guide a traveler safely across a desert or a navy into a hidden harbor. Yet this profound exchange was about far more than just adopting better tools or techniques. It represented a fundamental shift in the European intellectual mindset, a move away from insularity and toward a more global, interconnected view of the world. The Crusader states, particularly the Kingdom of Jerusalem, became improbable melting pots of knowledge. In cities like Acre and Antioch, scriptoriums buzzed with the activity of Christian monks, Jewish scholars, and Muslim savants, all working sometimes side by side, more often in a complex dance of indirect exchange through translated texts and shared observations. A Latin-speaking monk might painstakingly copy a star chart originally drawn in Arabic, while a Greek Orthodox scholar translated the geometric principles of Euclid from an Arabic commentary back into a language Europeans could understand. This was not a simple one-way transfer. It was a vibrant, multi-directional conversation. European cartographers brought their own traditions of pilgrimage mapping and local geography, which were then refined and elevated through contact with these more systematic Eastern approaches. The resulting maps were hybrid creations, unique artifacts of cultural collision and cooperation. They bore the precise coordinate grids of Islamic science, the detailed coastlines of Mediterranean portolan charts, and the symbolic illustrations of Christian sacred sites, all woven together into a single, coherent guide. This synthesis did not erase differences, but rather found a powerful common ground in the universal human desire to understand and navigate the world, proving that the pursuit of knowledge could, even amidst conflict, build bridges between seemingly irreconcilable worlds. Yet for all their celestial calculations and geometric precision, the maps these scholars created would have been stark, skeletal things without the rich, human texture provided by another vital source, the countless diaries, letters, and chronicles penned by pilgrims and travelers. Think of the mathematical data as the bones of the map, the essential, rigid framework that gave it structure and accuracy. But it was the anecdotal accounts that supplied the flesh and blood, the living detail that turned a technical diagram into a true guide to a foreign land. These written records offered something numbers could never convey, the qualitative experience of the journey itself. A trigonometric calculation could tell you the angle of a mountain path, but only a pilgrim's exhausted, breathless description could truly communicate its daunting steepness. A geometric plot could mark the location of a well, but only a merchant's account could warn that its water was brackish and best avoided in the summer months. This was the indispensable human intelligence that gave the maps their soul and their ultimate practicality. The process of gathering this intelligence was a monumental task of medieval crowdsourcing. Cartographers, often based in scriptoriums in coastal outposts like Acre or Jaffa, would eagerly seek out returning travelers. They would interview grizzled merchants who had traversed the Silk Road, questioning them on the conditions of the high passes in the Taurus Mountains. They would debrief dusty pilgrims fresh from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, noting their descriptions of the road from the coast to Jerusalem, where the shade was scarce, where bandits were known to lurk, which villages were friendly and which were not. They collected these fragments of lived experience like precious gems, comparing and contrasting different accounts to separate reliable fact from exaggerated rumor or faulty memory. The goal was to build a consensus of description, a collective testimony of the landscape that could be trusted. This was the original big data analysis, a painstaking effort to find patterns and truths within a vast, chaotic stream of subjective human observation. The real artistry began when the cartographer sat down to merge these two worlds, the objective and the subjective, the mathematical and the narrative. They would lay out their geometrically precise framework, the network of calculated distances and angles that formed the map's backbone. Then, like a storyteller weaving a tale, they would begin to annotate this skeleton with the intelligence from the travelogues. A simple line representing a road might be accompanied by a tiny note. 3 days' march to water here, or steep ascent, difficult for ox carts. A dot marking a settlement might be embellished with a symbol indicating a market for supplies or a fortress offering protection. This process of cross-referencing was crucial for validation. If 5 different pilgrims all described a particular valley as being lush and well-watered, it confirmed the cartographer's own calculations that a river should indeed be there. Conversely, if a trigonometric measurement suggested a direct route that every traveler reported as impassable due to swamps or cliffs, the mapmaker would trust the human experience and adjust the route accordingly, marking it as treacherous. The map became a living document, a dialogue between cold calculation and warm human experience. Consider the practical value of this synthesis for a Crusader knight, leading a contingent of soldiers from Antioch to Jerusalem. A purely mathematical map might show him the shortest possible route as a straight line, but a map enriched by pilgrim accounts would show him that the direct path cut through a waterless desert in summer, while a slightly longer route to the north offered reliable springs and safer camping grounds. It might warn him that a certain mountain pass, while mathematically viable, became a treacherous torrent after seasonal rains. It could even advise him on local customs, which tribal leaders were open to trade and which were hostile, allowing him to plan for diplomacy as well as defense. This depth of information transformed the map from a simple navigational aid into a comprehensive strategic tool. It didn't just answer the question, where is it? It answered the far more important questions, what is it like there, and how do I survive the journey? This fusion of storytelling and science did more than just ensure survival. It made the maps profoundly relatable. For a pilgrim setting out from Europe, clutching a copy of such a map, it offered more than directions, it offered a preview of the experience. The annotations and illustrations provided a sense of what to expect, easing the terror of the unknown. They transformed the journey from a blind leap of faith into a prepared pilgrimage, where challenges could be anticipated and wonders could be looked for. The map became a companion, a guide that spoke not just in miles and coordinates, but in the shared language of human experience, passed down from one traveler to the next and carefully, lovingly, inscribed into the very fabric of the chart by the cartographer, the ultimate synthesizer of all knowledge. Of all the regions these mapmakers sought to capture, none held a more potent mix of spiritual gravity and strategic necessity than the Holy Land itself. Jerusalem was not just a city on a hill, it was the ultimate prize, the spiritual center of the world for millions, and the key to controlling the entire Levant. For the Crusader cartographer, mapping this territory was the highest calling, a project that demanded an unparalleled fusion of devout reverence and cold, hard military calculation. The maps they produced were therefore unlike any others, serving two masters simultaneously, the soul of the pilgrim and the mind of the general. Every line drawn was an act of devotion, and every coordinate plotted was a potential battle plan, making these documents among the most complex and layered in all of medieval history. For the faithful undertaking the perilous journey from Europe, a map of the Holy Land was far more than a guide. It was a sacred text, a visual companion to the scriptures. These pilgrims, who had often risked their lives and spent their savings for a chance to walk in the footsteps of Christ, needed to know not just how to get to Jerusalem, but how to experience it. Cartographers catered to this deep spiritual hunger by meticulously plotting the locations of every significant biblical site. Using the geometric and trigonometric methods we've discussed, they would calculate the precise distances between the river Jordan and Bethlehem, or the exact route from the Mount of Olives to the Garden of Gethsemane. But they didn't stop with dry calculations. They embellished these points with beautiful, often lavish, religious iconography. The city of Jerusalem itself was frequently drawn as a perfect circle, a symbol of heavenly perfection, with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre dominating its center. Tiny illustrations of crosses marked the stations of the cross, and miniature ships sailing on the Sea of Galilee evoked the stories of the apostles. These maps were designed to be read on one's knees to inspire awe and reinforce faith, transforming a physical landscape into a spiritual pilgrimage. They allowed a traveler to trace the path of salvation history with their finger long before they ever set foot on the soil, making the daunting journey feel like a guided tour through hallowed ground. Yet, in the very same document, often on the very same parchment, existed a completely different set of data designed for an entirely different audience, the military commander. While a pilgrim saw pathways to grace, a knight saw avenues of attack and supply. The mathematical precision used to place a church was equally applied to charting the defensive walls of a Saracen fortress. The cartographer's skill in calculating elevation was used to determine the best approach for a siege tower or the optimal placement for a trebuchet. They meticulously mapped resources absolutely vital for any army: the locations of reliable freshwater springs, stands of timber suitable for building siege engines, quarries for stone, and pastures for grazing horses and livestock. A valley might be annotated with its carrying capacity for a camp, or a mountain pass might be marked with notes on its width, indicating how many men could march through it abreast. This strategic dimension transformed the map from an instrument of peace into a tool of war. The accuracy of these details was a matter of life and death on a massive scale. An incorrectly mapped water source could doom 1,000 men to thirst. An overestimated incline could render a key assault impossible. The cartographers working for the Crusader nobility understood that their work directly influenced the outcome of campaigns and the very survival of the fragile Crusader states. This dual purpose created a fascinating tension within the maps themselves. You might see the walls of Jerusalem drawn with perfect geometric accuracy, but then see them breached by an illustrated angel leading a victorious Crusader army, a blend of wishful divine intervention and practical engineering. A map might show the precise, measured route from Jaffa to Jerusalem, a vital supply line for any army holding the city, but then decorate the margins with scenes of pilgrims joyfully arriving at their destination. This wasn't a contradiction to the medieval mind. It was a complete worldview. Faith and force, the spiritual and the strategic, were two sides of the same coin in the Crusader project. The map had to serve both God and the sword equally. The cartographer was the unsung linchpin in this endeavor, their quiet calculations in a scriptorium enabling both the ecstatic prayers of the devout at the Holy Sepulchre and the shouted orders of a marshal directing troops from a high hill overlooking a battlefield. Their work ensured that the journey to the sacred could be made with certainty, and that the fight to keep it could be waged with clarity. Yet for all their sophisticated tools and borrowed knowledge, the reality on the ground presented a brutal and uncooperative world that refused to conform to neat mathematical models. The greatest adversary for the Crusader cartographer was not a foreign army, but the terrain itself, a relentless, shifting landscape that constantly tested the limits of their precision and their courage. Imagine trying to hold a quadrant steady to take a celestial reading while a searing desert wind whips stinging sand into your eyes, obscuring the very stars you're trying to measure. Or picture the frustration of carefully pacing out a distance through a dense Lebanese forest, only to find your path blocked by an uncharted ravine, forcing you to abandon your calculations and start again. This was the daily grind of mapping the unknown, a battle against an environment that was indifferent to their scholarly pursuits and often outright hostile to their survival. The most deceptive of these environments was the vast, sun-scorched desert. In theory, a flat, open desert should have been a cartographer's dream, offering clear sight lines for miles. In practice, it was a nightmare of illusions and inconsistencies. The relentless heat created shimmering mirages that could make a distant oasis appear miles closer than it actually was, or conjure phantom mountains on the horizon, utterly confounding attempts at accurate triangulation. More dangerously, the desert floor was never truly static. Seasonal winds, the infamous Khamsin, would reshape entire dune fields overnight, burying known trails and obliterating any temporary landmarks a traveling party might have relied upon. A carefully measured route between two wells, painstakingly calculated one season, could become a death trap the next, leading a caravan into a trackless waste where the only certainty was thirst. In this environment, the cartographer's rigid geometry had to yield to a more fluid, adaptive intelligence. They learned to incorporate environmental data into their equations, developing rules of thumb based on the endurance of their pack animals. They knew, for instance, that a camel could travel roughly 25 miles a day under a normal load in summer heat, and they used this camel time as a rough unit of measurement when other methods failed. They observed the patterns of desert wildlife, noting that certain birds always flew toward water at dusk, and they learned to read the subtle signs of ancient watercourses hidden beneath the sand. Their maps of these regions became living documents, annotated not just with distances, but with vital warnings about seasonal water availability and the direction of prevailing winds. If the desert was deceptive, the mountainous regions were defiantly obstructive. The jagged peaks of the Taurus and Anti-Lebanon ranges presented a completely different set of challenges. Here, the problem wasn't a lack of landmarks, but a dizzying surplus of them, all stacked on top of each other in a chaotic jumble. A straight-line distance calculated between 2 points was utterly useless when a 2,000-foot cliff face stood directly in the path. Trigonometric calculations for elevation were complicated by sudden, dense fog that could roll in without warning, shrouding a peak they had been measuring for hours. The cartographers had to become masters of indirect measurement, using a series of connected triangles to map a serpentine valley or a switchback mountain pass. They would climb to a high promontory, take bearings on several visible peaks, then descend into the valley, measure the distance they had traveled, and use that to calculate the heights and positions of the surrounding mountains. This process was incredibly physically demanding and fraught with danger. A misstep on a loose scree slope could mean a fatal fall. An unexpected storm could trap them for days. Their resilience in the face of these hardships is a testament to their dedication, proving that the ink on their maps was often tempered with sweat and sometimes even blood. Perhaps the most psychologically taxing challenge was the sheer isolation and the absence of any familiar reference points. For a scholar raised in the ordered landscapes of European farmlands and towns, the alien nature of the Levant could be deeply disorienting. The vegetation was strange, the sounds of the animals were unfamiliar, and the languages spoken by the local inhabitants were incomprehensible. This profound sense of dislocation made it difficult to trust their own observations. Was that strangely shaped rock formation a reliable landmark, or would it look completely different from another angle? Without local guides, which they often had to hire at great risk and expense, they were truly mapping terra incognita. This necessity forced upon them a certain humility and a pragmatic willingness to rely on others. They learned to value the practical, lived knowledge of Bedouin trackers and Armenian mountain guides, weaving their oral traditions into their own mathematical frameworks. The resulting maps were therefore not solely products of European intellect, but collaborative efforts forged in the difficult space between theoretical science and hard-earned local experience. Every line drawn across a mountain range, every dot marking a desert well, represented a small victory over the unknown, achieved not just with a sharp mind and a steady hand, but with raw, unwavering perseverance in the face of the world's most unforgiving geography. To truly appreciate the intellectual ambition of these Crusader mapmakers, we need to examine a specific masterpiece, and few are more revealing than the work of Matthew Paris. This 13th century Benedictine monk, based at the Abbey of St. Albans in England, never actually set foot in the Holy Land himself. Yet, through his meticulous maps, he transported countless pilgrims and scholars across the Mediterranean and deep into the heart of the biblical world. His achievement is a stunning testament to the power of second-hand information, refined through a rigorous process of collation, verification, and artistic genius. Paris did not simply copy existing charts. He synthesized a vast library of traveler accounts, pilgrim diaries, and earlier geographical works into a cohesive and startlingly practical visual narrative. He became a cartographic conductor, orchestrating a chorus of voices from the edges of Christendom into a single, harmonious guide. His most famous map, the one illustrating the route from London to Jerusalem, operates on multiple levels simultaneously. At its core, it is a functional itinerary, a step-by-step visual journey designed for a very practical purpose. For a pilgrim preparing to embark from England, this map was the ultimate pre-trip planner. Paris employed a brilliant technique known as strip mapping, where the route unspools like a ribbon across the parchment, with key cities and landmarks drawn in profile along its length. This wasn't a geographically precise layout in the modern sense. It prioritized the sequence of the journey over its exact spatial relationships. He annotated this visual pathway with precise, calculated distances between points measured in days' travel. A pilgrim could glance at the map and know that it was 5 days' walk from Acre to Nazareth, or that the arduous mountain passage from Antioch required 7 days with specific stops for rest and resupply. This practical data transformed an overwhelming, continent-spanning voyage into a series of manageable, predictable segments, reducing the terror of the unknown and replacing it with a clear, actionable plan. But Paris understood that a pilgrim's needs were not merely logistical, they were also spiritual and emotional. This is where his work transcends mere navigation and becomes a profound piece of devotional art. He populated his maps with vivid, miniature illustrations that brought the journey to life. A tiny, detailed drawing of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre awaited the traveler at the end of the road in Jerusalem. Along the way, they would encounter sketches of Mount Etna erupting in Sicily, ships navigating the treacherous currents of the Mediterranean, and even whimsical creatures lurking in the margins. These weren't just decorative flourishes, they were visual stories. They prepared the pilgrim for the wonders and dangers they might witness, feeding their imagination and strengthening their resolve. The map became a sacred storyboard, charting not only a physical path across land and sea, but also a spiritual ascent toward redemption. It balanced the cold calculus of distance with the warm, human need for wonder and meaning. What makes Paris's work a pinnacle of Crusader cartography is this masterful synthesis of seemingly opposite forces. He seamlessly wove together the objective and the subjective. The measured distances between cities reflect the geometric principles and collated data of a scientist, while the illustrations and annotations capture the qualitative experiences of a storyteller. He blended the local with the global, situating the familiar landscape of England within the vast, awe-inspiring context of a pilgrimage to the holy city of Jerusalem. His map is both a work of art, rich with color and detail, and a scientific document built upon a framework of reported facts and calculated measurements. In doing so, Matthew Paris embodied the very essence of the medieval scholarly mind, a mind that saw no contradiction between faith and reason, between beauty and utility. His maps stand as a lasting monument to the idea that the most useful guide is not just one that shows you the way, but one that also prepares your heart for the journey. While the Crusader mapmakers were driven by faith and military strategy, their most enduring and transformative legacy might just lie in the realm of commerce, where their precise charts quietly revolutionized the economy of an entire continent. For the merchants of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, these new maps were not spiritual guides or battle plans. They were the equivalent of today's confidential market reports and logistical software, unlocking wealth on an unprecedented scale. Before their advent, trade with the East was a terrifying gamble, a venture dominated by hearsay, rumor, and the exorbitant markups of countless middlemen who controlled segments of the long, fractured overland routes. A merchant would invest his entire fortune in a shipment of goods, then essentially pray that the caravan would navigate its way through a dozen different political territories and geographical hazards to eventually return with something of value. It was a high-stakes lottery where the house always won. The mathematically rigorous maps changed all of that, transforming blind speculation into calculated risk and, in doing so, building the foundations of modern capitalism. The most immediate impact was on the sheer practicality of the journey. A merchant captain sailing from Genoa to Alexandria no longer had to hug the coastline in a slow, cautious crawl, terrified of missing a landmark or being driven onto an uncharted reef. With a Portolan chart based on Crusader surveys, he could plot a more direct, open watercourse using the compass roses and room lines that crisscrossed the parchment. This shaved weeks off the voyage, meaning his perishable goods had a better chance of arriving in good condition, and he could complete more trips in a single sailing season. For the overland caravan master, the maps provided something even more precious: certainty about resources. They could now plan their entire route around known oases, secure mountain passes, and caravanserais where they could rest and resupply. This logistical planning drastically reduced the most common cause of failure: attrition. Fewer camels and horses died of thirst or exhaustion. Fewer guards were lost to ambushes in poorly chosen campsites, and more of the valuable cargo arrived intact at its destination. This reliability slashed the overhead costs of transportation, and those savings were passed down the line, making luxury goods like pepper, silk, and incense more affordable and accessible to a growing European middle class, stoking demand even further. This explosion in reliable trade routes led directly to the establishment of permanent European trading outposts, orphan daci, across the Levant. Coastal cities like Acre, Tyre, and Antioch became bustling hubs where Italian merchants could set up semi-permanent shop, negotiating directly with suppliers from further east without relying on Arab or Byzantine intermediaries. The maps were absolutely crucial for supplying these distant colonies. Administrators in Venice could now plan supply convoys with remarkable precision, knowing how much grain, wine, and building material was needed and how long it would take to get there. This created stable, enduring nodes of economic and cultural exchange that lasted long after the Crusader kingdoms themselves had fallen. The flow of goods became a two-way street. While silks and spices flowed west, European woolens, timber, and glassware flowed east, creating a truly interconnected economic system that spanned the Mediterranean. The profitability of these newly secure trade ventures created a powerful feedback loop, a virtuous cycle that fueled its own expansion. Successful merchant guilds and wealthy trading families, seeing the immense returns on their investments, began to actively fund further exploration and cartography. They became the venture capitalists of the late medieval period, commissioning mapmakers to produce ever more detailed charts of specific regions, to seek out new, faster routes and to investigate rumors of markets deeper in Asia. This private investment accelerated the pace of geographical discovery far beyond what the Crusader military effort alone could have achieved. The mapmaker, once primarily a tool of the church or the crown, now also served the purse, his work directly financed by the very commerce it enabled. This relationship between capital and cartography laid the groundwork for the great age of exploration that would follow, proving that the pursuit of profit could be as powerful a driver of discovery as the pursuit of empire or knowledge. Ultimately, the legacy of these maps is woven into the very fabric of global history. The flourishing trade networks they facilitated, the Silk Road by land and the spice route by sea, did more than just fill European markets with exotic goods. They connected continents. They created a steady flow of not only products but also people, ideas, technologies, and cultures between Europe and Asia. This economic interdependence made the world significantly smaller and more interconnected, fostering an exchange that would eventually help pull Europe out of its medieval isolation and into the Renaissance. The mathematical lines drawn by those dedicated Crusader cartographers in their quiet scriptoriums became the invisible highways upon which the wealth of nations traveled, proving that the most powerful force in shaping the modern world wasn't always the sword. Sometimes it was simply a better map. The meticulous maps born from the Crusades did more than guide armies and merchants. They navigated their way into the very heart of European intellectual life, finding a new home in the bustling, debate-filled halls of emerging medieval universities. Places like Oxford, Bologna, and Paris were becoming powerhouses of scholarship, and within their walls, the discipline of cartography began to shed its status as a mere practical craft and was reborn as a respected scientific pursuit. The maps arriving from the Levant, with their precise geometric frameworks and layers of synthesized data, were not simply filed away as curiosities. Instead, they were pored over by scholars and students as masterful case studies in applied mathematics, tangible proof of how abstract principles could be used to tame the chaos of the physical world. A lecture on Euclid's geometry was no longer just theory when a professor could unfurl a chart of the Holy Land and point to the triangulated distances between cities, showing the theorems in action. This integration of Crusader cartography into the academic mainstream was a pivotal moment, ensuring that the hard-won knowledge from the field didn't fade away but was instead preserved, systematized, and pushed forward by the brightest minds of a new generation. This academic embrace formalized the teaching of mapmaking as a discipline in its own right, taught alongside the quadrivium, the four core mathematical arts of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. A student pursuing a degree wouldn't just learn to recite astronomical tables. They would learn how to use those tables to calculate latitude with an astrolabe. They wouldn't just study the abstract properties of triangles. They would learn the specific trigonometric calculations used to estimate the height of a mountain pass from a distance. The curriculum itself began to reflect this new, practical emphasis. Textbooks, often painstakingly copied by hand, started to include entire chapters dedicated to practica, the practical application of surveying and navigation techniques, many of which were direct adaptations of methods refined by Crusader mapmakers working under pressure in foreign lands. The university scriptorium, once focused primarily on producing religious and philosophical texts, now also became a workshop where new maps were drafted based on these academic principles, creating a continuous feedback loop between theoretical learning and practical output. Perhaps the most vibrant contribution of the university setting was the culture of rigorous debate and critique it fostered. These were not quiet places of unquestioning acceptance. they were dynamic arenas where scholars from different regions and traditions would gather to argue, challenge, and refine ideas. A map from a Crusader scriptorium in Acre wouldn't be taken as gospel. A mathematician in Bologna might scrutinize its geometric projections, questioning the scale used in a particular region. An astronomer in Oxford might cross-reference its celestial coordinates against his own observations, suggesting improvements to the calculations. This collaborative, often contentious, environment was a crucible for innovation. It pushed cartography beyond the replication of existing techniques and encouraged scholars to ask fundamental questions about how to represent a spherical world on a flat sheet of parchment, a problem that would eventually lead to revolutionary projection systems. The practical, field-tested experience of the Crusader mapmakers provided the raw, reliable data, and the theoretical rigor of the university scholars provided the framework to analyze, systematize, and ultimately improve upon it. This fusion of the practical and the theoretical, the adventurer's grit and the scholar's precision, created a powerful engine for progress that would ultimately set the stage for the globe-spanning voyages of explorers like Columbus and da Gama, who carried with them maps built upon this centuries-old academic foundation. While the intellectual frameworks of geometry and astronomy provided the mind for Crusader cartography, it was the physical medium, the very parchment and ink, that gave it a durable body capable of surviving the brutal realities of long-distance travel. This was not the kind of paper we know today, fragile and susceptible to moisture. The mapmaker's canvas was parchment, or its finer cousin vellum, made from the carefully scraped and stretched skins of sheep, calves, or goats. The creation of a single sheet was a laborious, weeks-long process of soaking, deherring, stretching, and drying, resulting in an incredibly tough, flexible, and nearly waterproof material. This durability was non-negotiable. A map guiding a fleet across the storm-tossed Mediterranean or a caravan through a desert sandstorm had to withstand being rolled, unrolled, soaked by spray, and baked by sun without cracking or fading. The choice of material was a direct response to the demands of the new navigation, ensuring that the precious calculations inscribed upon it would outlast the journey. The inks, too, were specially formulated for permanence. Iron gall ink, the standard of the era, was a potent mixture of iron salts and tannic acids extracted from gallnuts, growths found on oak trees. When applied to parchment, it initially appeared a faint grayish color, but upon exposure to air, it oxidized into a deep, lasting black that bonded fiercely with the animal skin. For colors vital for coding information and adding illustrative detail, cartographers turned to a vibrant palette of natural pigments. Ground lapis lazuli produced a brilliant, costly blue for oceans. Crushed madder root created a rich red for important routes or danger zones, and malachite offered a verdant green for fertile coastal regions. These were often mixed with egg whites or gum arabic as a binding agent, creating paints that remained vivid for centuries. The map itself was therefore a physical artifact of immense value, a fusion of rare materials and skilled craftsmanship, reflecting the critical importance of the information it carried. The most revolutionary innovation in format, however, was undoubtedly the portolan chart. Emerging from the maritime traditions of the Mediterranean, these were maps fundamentally different from the symbolic world maps of earlier centuries. Their primary purpose was not theological or artistic, but intensely practical, to get a ship from one port to another as safely and directly as possible. The word portolan itself comes from the Italian portolano, meaning a pilot's book or guide, and these charts were the ultimate visual expression of that guiding principle. What made them instantly recognizable and utterly transformative was their signature web of room lines. These were straight lines radiating from a series of compass roses strategically placed across the chart, creating a dense, overlapping network that covered the entire parchment like a spider's web. A sailor would simply lay a ruler between his current location and his desired destination, find the room line that most closely matched its angle, and then set his course to maintain that constant compass bearing. This system translated the complex, curved reality of sailing on a spherical Earth into a simple, actionable straight-line course on a flat map, a breakthrough of immense practical utility. The accuracy of these courses depended entirely on the compass rose, the intricate star-shaped diagram that was the heart and soul of the Portolan chart. Each rose was a precise circle graduated with the 32 points of the mariner's compass north, north by northeast, northeast, and so on. The room lines radiated from these roses, each line labeled with the compass direction it represented. This created an interactive grid that allowed for precise course plotting and recalculation if blown off course by a storm. The Crusader cartographers, with their deep grounding in land-based geometric surveying, saw the potential to refine these primarily nautical tools. They began to superimpose the detailed terrestrial data they were gathering, the accurate outlines of coastlines, the positions of river mouths, the topography of inland regions, onto the dense room line networks of the Portolan. The result was a powerful hybrid, a chart that could guide a captain into a safe harbor and then provide a knight with a reliable map of the hinterlands, showing the roads to the next fortress or the mountain passes leading to a strategic objective. This synthesis of maritime and terrestrial mapping was a monumental leap in navigational thinking. It broke down the artificial barrier between sea and land, creating a seamless geographic continuum that reflected the true nature of Crusader movement, which relied on a constant interplay between naval supply ships and land-based armies. A single, well-crafted chart could now plan an entire campaign, from the Genos galley rowing along the coast to the knights disembarking at a fortified port to their march inland along a mapped road. The durability of the parchment and the clarity of the ink ensured this vital information survived the rigors of both environments. These innovations in materials and design did more than just make travel easier. They created a new, integrated understanding of space, weaving together the sea lanes and the caravan routes into a single, coherent system of movement and control that would dominate Mediterranean navigation for centuries to come. Yet for all their mathematical brilliance and cross-cultural collaboration, we must also confront a more complex and sobering truth about these Crusader maps. They were never simply neutral documents of discovery. Each carefully inked line and precisely plotted coordinate was also a statement of power, a declaration of ownership and control over lands that were already deeply known to others. The very act of mapping, of reducing a living, breathing landscape to a set of European measurements and names, was an inherently political act, one that often overrode millennia of indigenous knowledge with a new, foreign grid of understanding. The Crusader cartographer, armed with his astrolabe and his faith, was not just an explorer, he was also, in a very real sense, a conqueror wielding a new kind of weapon, one that could claim territory on parchment long before an army could secure it on the ground. This colonial mindset is starkly visible in the choices made on these maps. Place names that had been used for centuries by Arab, Armenian, and Syrian communities were frequently erased and replaced with Latin or Old French approximations, or with names drawn from biblical tradition that reinforced a Christian claim to the territory. A thriving Muslim town might be diminished to a tiny dot on the chart, while a newly built Crusader fortress nearby would be drawn large and labeled prominently, visually asserting the new power structure. The intricate networks of local trails, sacred sites, and seasonal routes known to Bedouin guides were often ignored in favor of the straight, militarized roads that best served the movement of European troops and supply trains. In this way, the map became a tool of domination, creating a version of reality that centered the Crusader experience and marginalized the existing inhabitants, effectively cartographing them out of their own homeland. It was a form of informational imperialism, where controlling the representation of the world was the first step toward controlling the world itself. However, to paint all these mapmakers with the same broad brush would be to ignore the fascinating and often surprising nuances in their work. The reality on the ground was far messier than a simple story of oppressor and oppressed. Many cartographers, particularly those who spent years in the Levant, developed a profound respect for local expertise. They quickly learned that their abstract calculations were useless without the on-the-ground intelligence of those who knew the land intimately. There are accounts of these scholars hiring local guides, Christian Syrians, Muslim geographers, and Jewish travelers, and spending hours in conversation with them, carefully incorporating their detailed knowledge of mountain passes, desert water sources, and hidden harbors into the European maps. In these moments, the map-making process became a genuine, albeit unequal, collaboration. The resulting charts were hybrid creations, a fusion of European mathematical framework and deeply local, place-based knowledge. This pragmatic approach reveals a tension at the heart of the enterprise, a drive to dominate and claim, constantly checked by a practical need to understand and accurately represent, forcing an often reluctant respect for the very cultures they sought to overpower. This historical tension offers a powerful and deeply relevant lesson for our own time. It reminds us that a map is never just a map. It is a cultural artifact, deeply embedded in the worldview, ambitions, and biases of its creators. Whether it's a Crusader chart centering Jerusalem, a medieval Islamic map placing the South at the top, or a modern digital map projecting the globe in a way that exaggerates the size of northern nations, every cartographic choice tells a story about power and priority. The Crusader experience teaches us to look at any map with a critical eye, to ask not just what does it show, but who made it and for what purpose. And crucially, what knowledge, what perspectives might be missing from this particular version of the world. In an era of digital mapping and satellite surveillance, where borders are still disputed and geographic information is a key tool of political influence, this lesson is more vital than ever. The lines we draw on maps, whether with quill on parchment or with algorithms on a screen, continue to shape conflicts, economies, and identities. The legacy of the Crusader cartographers, therefore, is a double-edged sword, a breathtaking demonstration of human ingenuity and a timeless warning about the danger of letting a single, powerful perspective define reality for everyone else. Their story challenges us to pursue a more inclusive cartography, one that listens as well as measures, and that recognizes all the different ways there are to know a place. The meticulous charts born from the Crusader states did not simply fade into history. Instead, they became the essential seeds from which the entire garden of Renaissance cartography would spectacularly bloom. This was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual, powerful evolution, where the mathematical tools and empirical mindset honed in the Levant were carried back to Europe, carefully studied, and then radically expanded by a new generation of thinkers. The foundational work of those earlier mapmakers, their commitment to measurement, their synthesis of observation and calculation, their development of precise instruments provided the crucial bedrock. It gave Renaissance scholars something their medieval predecessors largely lacked: a reliable, quantitatively tested body of geographical data and a proven methodology for adding to it. This allowed them to stop rediscovering the known world and start discovering the unknown one, using a cartographic language that had been refined in the fires of necessity during the Crusades. We can see this direct lineage most clearly in the work of giants like Gerardus Mercator and Abraham Ortelius. Mercator's famous world map of 1569 and his revolutionary projection system released in 1570 are unthinkable without the centuries of groundwork that came before. The Crusader cartographers had mastered the art of accurately representing small, regional areas through painstaking triangulation and celestial navigation. Mercator's genius was to take this principle of mathematical precision and apply it to the entire globe, solving the epic puzzle of how to represent the spherical Earth on a flat sheet of paper for the purpose of navigation. His projection, where lines of constant bearing are straight lines, was the ultimate sophistication of the room line system found on Portolan charts. It was a theoretical leap, yes, but one built upon an immense pyramid of practical, accumulated knowledge about distances, coordinates, and the shape of continents, a pyramid whose foundations were laid by mapmakers working for Crusader kings. Similarly, Abraham Ortelius's monumental achievement, the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, considered the first modern atlas, was fundamentally an act of synthesis on a global scale. His method was to collect, compare, and critically evaluate the best available maps from across Europe, then reconcile them into a single, coherent view of the world. A significant portion of those source maps, especially for the Mediterranean and the Near East, could trace their own lineage back to the hybrid European-Arabic cartographic traditions that flourished in ports like Acre and Alexandria. The very concept of a uniform, systematic collection of maps presented in a standardized format owes a debt to the Crusader era shift away from unique, symbolic artifacts toward practical, reproducible tools based on a common mathematical language. Ortelius wasn't just making a book of maps, he was curating a global knowledge system, and the Crusader emphasis on accuracy and utility helped make that system possible. This continuity provided the essential bridge that connected the medieval and modern worlds of mapmaking. Before the Crusades, European maps were often theological diagrams. After the Renaissance, they were scientific instruments. The critical transition period between these two extremes was fueled by the practical needs of the Crusader states. Their maps served as a living laboratory where classical knowledge from Greece and Rome was merged with cutting-edge science from the Islamic world and then stress-tested in the field. The resulting innovations in instrument design, in navigational technique, in the very expectation of accuracy, were the necessary precursors that enabled the age of exploration. You cannot embark on a voyage to circumnavigate the globe unless you have a reasonable confidence that your charts won't lead you off the edge of a flat Earth. The work of the Crusader cartographers helped provide that confidence, replacing myth with measurement and superstition with coordinates. The legacy of this intellectual transfer is a powerful testament to how innovation echoes across centuries, often in unexpected ways. The geometric calculations made to ensure a Crusader army could find water in the Judean desert eventually contributed to the maps that guided Spanish galleons to the Americas. The astrolabe readings taken to chart the coastline of Cyprus helped refine the tools that Portuguese navigators used to sail around the Cape of Good Hope. This wasn't a straight line of progress, but a rich, interconnected web of knowledge passed down, improved upon, and repurposed for new ambitions. The Renaissance mapmakers, standing on the shoulders of these medieval giants, could see further and draw with greater certainty, their pens tracing the outlines of continents that the Crusaders could never have imagined, but using a language of precision those earlier pioneers had worked so hard to invent. Even with all their sophisticated tools and meticulous methods, the maps left behind by these Crusader cartographers are not flawless documents of absolute truth. They are captivating tapestries woven with equal threads of brilliant calculation and bewildering mystery. Some of the most intriguing questions they raise involve places the mapmakers almost certainly never set foot in themselves. How, for instance, did they chart the vast, empty stretches of the Arabian desert or the remote highlands of Armenia with such apparent confidence? The answer lies in a delicate and daring act of mathematical extrapolation. They would begin with a handful of firmly anchored, known points coastal cities whose coordinates could be reliably fixed by celestial observation. Then, like master weavers, they would use the threads of second-hand accounts from travelers, merchants, and even captured prisoners to spin out a web of connections deep into the unknown. If 3 separate sources described a journey of 10 days southeast from a known city to a fabled oasis, the cartographer could use that travel time to estimate a distance, plot a point, and begin constructing a geometric framework around it. This was an act of profound trust and interpretation, turning spoken words and remembered experiences into fixed points on a grid. The resulting maps are therefore a unique fusion of hard-won empirical data and informed, yet ultimately unverified, speculation, a reminder that every line drawn was a calculated risk. These necessary leaps of faith inevitably led to fascinating anomalies that pepper their work, creating a world where stark realism brushes shoulders with pure fantasy. Along the margins of seas they had not fully sailed, one might find the warning phrase, "Hic sunt dracones," here be dragons accompanied by illustrations of monstrous serpents poised to devour unwary ships. In the blank spaces of Africa, they might draw the figure of a cyapod, a mythical creature with a single, giant foot it used to shade itself from the sun, a tale inherited from ancient Greek texts they trusted implicitly. Were these decorative flourishes intentional warnings to deter competitors or sincere beliefs? Often, they were a bit of all three. More puzzling than outright myths are the simple misplacements of very real places. A particular mountain range might be rendered at double its actual size, or a vital river might be shown flowing from the wrong lake. These errors are not random. They are windows into the limitations of their knowledge network. A mountain described as immense by an awe-struck pilgrim might be interpreted as cartographically larger than it was. A river's source, described by a merchant who only knew a segment of its course, might be incorrectly deduced. Each anomaly is a clue, a frozen moment of misinterpretation that tells us as much about their methods as their successes do. This leads directly into a heated debate that continues to engage scholars today. When we find a clear error on a Crusader map, are we looking at a mistake or a choice? Was a coastline drawn incorrectly because of a miscalculated stellar observation, an error in trigonometric computation, or a misreadings of a tidal chart? Or was the distortion intentional? Some historians argue that certain inaccuracies were a form of early security classification. A map made for military use might deliberately shorten the distance between two fortresses to make a defensive line appear stronger, or it might omit a small, easily overlooked mountain pass to prevent an enemy from discovering a backdoor route into a kingdom. Other maps designed to inspire wealthy patrons to fund expeditions might exaggerate the size of a region rumored to be rich in gold or spices. The line between an honest mistake and a strategic deception is often blurry, forcing us to consider that these documents were not just scientific instruments, but also tools of persuasion, propaganda, and power. The very fact that we can't always tell the difference adds a layer of intrigue to their study, reminding us that every map is, to some extent, a reflection of the agenda of its creator. Ultimately, these mysteries and imperfections do not diminish the achievements of the Crusader cartographers. They humanize them. They show us the boundaries of even the most precise system when it confronts the vastness of the unknown. They highlight the immense courage it took to commit to a line on parchment that would guide real people into real danger, based on a fragile combination of numbers and stories. These gaps between the data they possessed and the world they imagined are not failures, but invitations for us to step into their shoes, to feel the weight of their responsibility, and to marvel at the audacity of their project. They remind us that mapping is not just a science of measurement, but also an art of interpretation, a continuous negotiation between what can be known for certain and what must be dared, a dance between the unwavering rules of mathematics and the boundless realms of human imagination. It might seem like a vast leap from parchment and astrolabes to the digital glow of a smartphone map, but the fundamental principles guiding a Crusader cartographer and a modern geospatial analyst are strikingly, powerfully similar. Both are engaged in the same essential quest: to transform a chaotic, unknown world into an ordered, navigable system using the best tools and data available to them. The medieval mapmakers' painstaking process of layering celestial mathematics with pilgrim anecdotes finds its direct descendant in our contemporary geographic information systems, or GIS. These powerful digital platforms are the modern scriptoriums, where instead of one scholar collating reports, we now have algorithms that synthesize countless layers of information: satellite imagery, census data, real-time traffic reports, social media feeds, and layer them atop a precise mathematical grid of latitude and longitude. This isn't just a technological upgrade. It's the same philosophy of cross-verification, the same insistence that the truest picture emerges from combining quantitative measurement with qualitative human experience, now operating at a speed and scale those medieval scholars could scarcely dream of. Consider the challenge of mapping a remote or dangerous area today, like the dense rainforests of the Amazon or the shifting ice sheets of the Arctic. Modern cartographers face the same core problem as their Crusader predecessors: how to map what you cannot easily walk. Their solution is a high-tech echo of the old methods. Instead of relying on the camel time estimations of Bedouin guides, we use satellite-based radar and LiDAR to penetrate cloud cover and vegetation, building a digital elevation model of the terrain below. Drones now fly the routes that would have been too perilous for a lone surveyor, capturing millions of data points to create a point cloud that software then translates into an incredibly detailed three-dimensional map. This adaptive use of technology to overcome environmental hostility is a direct inheritance from the mapmakers who customized their astrolabes for desert heat or developed new trigonometric workarounds for impassable mountain ranges. The tools have changed, but the innovative spirit, the relentless drive to see the unseen, remains utterly unchanged. This historical perspective offers more than just a fascinating parallel. It provides crucial insights for tackling some of our most pressing modern challenges. The Crusader maps were vital for logistics and crisis management, guiding supply caravans and planning for sieges. Today, that same cartographic intelligence is deployed in urban planning and disaster response with life-saving consequences. Before building a new subway line, city planners use advanced GIS to layer geological surveys, population density maps, and existing utility lines, avoiding the modern equivalent of leading an army into a box canyon. When a hurricane or wildfire strikes, emergency responders don't rely on a single source of information. They use dynamic maps that combine real-time satellite data on the fire's spread, mathematical models of wind patterns, and qualitative crowdsourced reports from people on the ground using social media, a perfect modern mirror of the Crusader practice of merging geometric calculations with first-hand traveler accounts to build the most complete and actionable picture possible. Perhaps the most profound lesson from the Crusader cartographers is one of resilience in the face of incomplete information. They operated in a world full of gaps, forced to make critical decisions based on a patchwork of hard data and soft intelligence. Our modern systems, for all their power, can create an illusion of omniscience. A GPS unit can give a driver such unwavering confidence in its turn-by-turn directions that it sometimes leads them straight into a lake or down a closed road, a digital age version of a mirage. The Crusaders understood that a map is a model, not reality itself. It is a tool to be interpreted with wisdom and context. Their legacy reminds today's data scientists and urban planners to temper the cold certainty of algorithms with a warm, nuanced understanding of human context and local knowledge. It teaches us that the most resilient systems are those that, like the best medieval maps, leave room for annotation, for uncertainty, and for the invaluable wisdom that comes not from a satellite, but from the people who actually walk the land. In the end, the greatest tool is not the technology itself, but the human ingenuity that learns from the past to navigate the future. Yet for all the sophisticated tools and grand historical forces at play, we must never forget that these revolutionary maps were not created by abstract systems or impersonal institutions. They were painstakingly crafted by individual human beings, men whose names are largely lost to history, who worked in the shadows of kings and conquerors. These cartographers were the ultimate unsung heroes of the Crusades, facing a unique combination of physical peril and immense intellectual pressure with nothing but their wits, their courage, and an unshakable dedication to the truth. While chroniclers celebrated the knights who stormed castle walls, these quiet scholars were engaged in a different kind of conquest, a relentless assault on the frontiers of ignorance, one precise measurement at a time. Their scriptoriums were not always quiet cloisters. Often, they were makeshift tents buzzing with the chaos of a military camp, or the dusty back rooms of a merchant's house in a bustling, dangerous port city. They faced the very real threat of disease, banditry, and warfare, venturing out into hostile territories to take their readings, knowing that a single misstep could mean capture or death. Their work required the stamina of a soldier, the patience of a monk, and the brilliant mind of a scientist, all fused into one. Consider the daily reality for one such anonymous mapmaker attached to a Crusader lord's retinue. His day might begin before dawn, climbing to a high vantage point to take a clear astrolabe reading of the stars before the sun washed them out. Every calculation was a race against time, weather, and the ever-present anxiety of being discovered. He would spend hours huddled over his parchment, cross-referencing a nervous merchant's description of a coastal cave with the angles he measured himself, trying to reconcile conflicting accounts into a single, reliable truth. His tools, though advanced for their time, were frustratingly limited. A cloudy night could ruin a week's work by obscuring the celestial markers he depended on. A strong wind could make it impossible to hold his quadrant steady. The ink might freeze in its pot during a cold night or run in the humid heat of the day. Every single line on his map was a hard-won victory over 1,000 small adversities, a testament to a kind of perseverance we can scarcely imagine in our age of satellite precision and instant digital access. What drove these individuals? It was likely a complex mix of faith, scholarly obsession, and a simple, powerful desire to create order from chaos. For some, mapping the Holy Land was a devotional act, a way to serve God by illuminating the pathways to sacred sites. For others, it was the pure intellectual thrill of solving an immense, real-world puzzle, of being the first to accurately connect 2 points on a vast and mysterious canvas. They were driven by a profound commitment to accuracy, not because it was easy, but because they understood the consequences of error. A miscalculated distance wasn't just a smudge on parchment. It could lead a company of soldiers into an ambush or a caravan of pilgrims into a waterless desert. This weight of responsibility must have been immense, a constant companion to their scholarly pursuits. They operated without fame or glory, their names absent from the victory parades and the history books, their greatest achievement being a map that was used until it frayed at the edges and was then discarded, its information absorbed into the next, better iteration. Their legacy is the opposite of a statue in a town square. It is invisible, woven into the very fabric of how we came to understand the world, a silent foundation upon which all modern geography is built. By remembering their humanity, their fears, their frustrations, their quiet dedication, we add a crucial layer of depth to our appreciation of their work. It transforms their mathematical triumphs from cold, abstract facts into warm, human stories of curiosity and courage against impossible odds. The entire monumental endeavor began not in a quiet scriptorium, but out in the field, amidst the very landscapes they sought to capture. A typical surveying expedition was a small, mobile operation, a team of 3 or 4 individuals, each with a specialized role, venturing into territory that was often unpredictable and hostile. The lead cartographer, the Magister Cartographers, directed the operation. He was accompanied by an assistant who handled the heavier equipment, a tripod for the astrolabe, a supply of parchment for field notes, and the all-important chest of inks and pigments. Often, a local guide was an essential, if unofficial, 4th member of the team, providing not just safe passage but invaluable on-the-ground knowledge about seasonal trails and hidden water sources that no instrument could detect. Their first task upon reaching a suitable vantage point was to establish a baseline. This was the fundamental first line from which all other measurements would triangulate. Using calibrated chains or simply pacing out a known distance between 2 prominent, immovable features, a distinctive rock formation and a gnarled ancient tree, for instance, they created the first solid piece of data in a sea of unknowns. With a baseline established, the intricate dance of angular measurement could commence. The assistant would carefully set up the astrolabe or quadrant on its tripod, ensuring it was perfectly level. The Magister would then sight along the alidade, aligning it with a distant mountain peak, a minaret in a far-off city, or the curve of a distant bay. His assistant would call out the angle as the plumb bob settled against the graduated scale, while a second scribe hastily recorded the figure on a wax tablet, along with a rough sketch of the target and any notes about its appearance. This process was repeated over and over from multiple different vantage points, creating a complex web of intersecting sight lines. A single peak might be measured from 3 or 4 different positions, each reading helping to pin down its location with greater certainty through the relentless logic of trigonometry. They were effectively building an invisible net of triangles across the landscape, a geometric skeleton that would later be fleshed out with the details of topography and place names. This fieldwork was grueling and demanded immense patience. A sudden cloud bank or a gust of wind could ruin hours of effort, forcing the team to wait or even return another day to complete their set of observations. Once back in the relative safety and stability of their scriptorium, the true intellectual alchemy began. The team would transition from surveyors to calculators, spreading their field notes across a large drafting table. This was where the raw, angular data was transformed into precise distances and coordinates. Using compasses and straightedges, they would first draw the established baseline to a chosen scale on a large sheet of preliminary paper. Then, using the recorded angles, they would construct each triangle in the network one by one. If they knew the length of one side of a triangle and the angles at both ends, they could geometrically determine the lengths of the other two sides and the location of the opposite point. This process of triangulation allowed them to accurately plot the position of every feature they had observed, building up the map from a known point out into the unknown. The scriptorium would be filled with the soft scratch of pens and the murmur of low conversation as the team verified each other's calculations, checking for errors that could compound and throw the entire map into disarray. This phase was a silent testament to their mathematical rigor, a painstaking puzzle where every piece had to fit perfectly with the next. Only when this precise geometric framework was complete and verified would the final, most celebrated member of the team step in, the illuminator or illustrator. While the magister and his assistants worked in stark, precise lines of graphite and ink, the illuminator worked in vibrant pigments of lapis lazuli blue, verdigris green, and crimson lake. Their task was to translate the dry mathematical data into a visually intuitive and informative masterpiece. Using the triangulated points as anchors, they would carefully ink in the coastlines, using a steady hand to render the subtle curves of a bay. They would draw the sinuous paths of rivers and the jagged profiles of mountain ranges, their artistry giving form to the arithmetic. Cities and towns were marked not with simple dots, but with tiny, intricate drawings of walls, towers, and churches, their size often denoting their importance rather than their physical scale. Forests were suggested with clusters of stylized trees, and treacherous areas like swamps or sand dunes were indicated with subtle patterns and colors. The illuminator also added the all-important textual annotations, names of regions, distances between points, and warnings about local hazards, their elegant calligraphy filling the blank spaces with practical knowledge. This collaboration between scientist and artist was essential. The mathematician's framework ensured the map could be trusted with a life, while the artist's embellishments made it a usable, relatable guide for the traveler. The final act was the transfer of this completed draft onto the most precious medium, a sheet of fine vellum. This was done with painstaking care, often by tracing the lines through a prepared sheet of parchment that had been rubbed with pumice stone to create a slightly translucent surface. Once the outline was transferred, the illuminator would begin the slow process of painting, mixing pigments with egg tempera to create lasting colors. The completed map was then sometimes varnished with a thin layer of gum arabic to protect it from the elements before being rolled into a protective leather case, ready to guide its user across continents. This entire workflow, from the windy hilltop with an astrolabe to the hushed scriptorium with its odor of ink and varnish, mirrors almost exactly the pipeline of modern digital cartography. Today, satellite imagery and GPS provide the raw data, the baseline, and the angles, which is then processed by geographic information systems that perform the trigonometric calculations, creating a digital framework. Graphic designers and data visualization specialists then become the modern illuminators, designing the layers, icons, and typography that make the map readable and useful on our screens. The tools have changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental human process of observing, calculating, and beautifully illustrating our world remains a timeless testament to our need to understand and navigate the spaces around us. Yet this powerful fusion of faith and cartography was never a simple one. The very strength of these symbols, their ability to inspire and guide, could also distort the very reality the mapmakers worked so hard to capture with their mathematics. A profound tension existed between the spiritual imperative to represent the world as a stage for divine drama and the practical need to represent it as a physical space to be navigated. This is most evident in the deliberate alterations of scale and proportion. Jerusalem, the spiritual center of the Christian world, was almost always drawn disproportionately large on these maps. On some, it appears as a massive, detailed fortress city that visually dominates the entire region of Palestine, its walls and towers rendered with a precision that far outstrips its actual geographical footprint. This wasn't an error in calculation, it was a conscious cartographic choice. The size of a city on the map reflected its importance in the eyes of God and the Crusader, not its square mileage. Similarly, the routes leading to holy sites like the River Jordan or the Mount of Olives might be drawn wider and more prominently than other roads, visually prioritizing the pilgrim's path over the merchant's track. These biases, woven directly into the parchment, served a powerful psychological purpose. They reinforced the Crusader worldview for the map's user, constantly reminding them that they were traversing not just a physical landscape, but a sacred one, where spiritual significance outweighed earthly geography. This symbolic language extended far beyond city sizes to the very orientation and structure of the world itself. Many maps from this period, known as T and O maps, present a stunningly symbolic view of the Earth. They depict the world as a perfect circle, the O, divided by a T-shaped body of water representing the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile River, and the Don River. This T cruciform neatly separated the three known continents, Asia perched above the crossbar, with Europe and Africa below, and placed Jerusalem squarely at the center of this cosmic diagram. North, south, east, and west were not aligned with our modern cardinal directions. Instead, east was typically placed at the top, as it was the direction of paradise and the rising sun. This meant that the viewer was literally looking upward toward salvation. These maps were never intended for navigation. They were theological statements, teaching tools that illustrated the order of God's creation and humanity's place within it. They served as a constant visual sermon, reinforcing the idea that the world was a designed, meaningful whole with Christianity at its spiritual and symbolic center. For a crusader or a pilgrim, even a more practical map would carry echoes of this worldview, subtly reinforcing their mission as a journey from the periphery of the world toward its sacred heart. The most fascinating aspect of Crusader cartography is how these two seemingly opposite impulses, rigorous mathematics and devout symbolism, not only coexisted but actively collaborated on the same piece of parchment. A single map could feature a coastline charted with astonishing geometric accuracy based on astrolabe readings and sailor reports, while its interior was filled with illustrations of Moses receiving the tablets on Mount Sinai or the walls of Jericho tumbling down. A precisely calculated distance between two cities might be written in the margin right next to a tiny drawing of a mythical creature said to inhabit that region. This was not seen as a contradiction. To the medieval mind, the world operated on two parallel levels: the literal, physical reality that could be measured and mapped, and the spiritual, allegorical reality that gave that physical world its true meaning. A map was incomplete if it only showed one. The mathematical data ensured the traveler's body arrived safely at its destination. The religious symbolism ensured their soul understood the significance of the journey. The mapmaker's role was to be a bridge between these two worlds, using the emerging tools of science to document God's creation, while using the ancient language of symbol to interpret its divine purpose. This delicate balance ultimately produced documents of incredible power and utility. They were simultaneously wayfinders for the body and guidebooks for the soul. A knight could use the map to plan a military campaign, assessing the defensibility of a valley or the distance to a fortress, while also being reminded of the sacred nature of the land he was fighting for by the crosses marking a nearby holy site. A pilgrim could follow the measured day's journey between hostels while also preparing their spirit for the awe they would feel upon finally seeing the illustrated Church of the Holy Sepulchre in person. The map managed to be both a strategic tool for earthly conquest and an object of meditation for spiritual contemplation. This dual nature is the true masterpiece of Crusader cartography. It reflects the entire Crusader endeavor itself, a collision of the material and the spiritual, the calculated and the faithful, the sword and the cross. The maps they left behind are not just records of where they went. They are profound reflections of who they were and how they saw their world, a divinely ordered creation, fraught with physical peril but overflowing with spiritual promise, waiting to be both measured and redeemed. To truly grasp the genius of Crusader cartography, we must place their work not in isolation, but alongside that of their brilliant contemporaries, the master mapmakers of the Islamic world. This comparison reveals a fascinating divergence in philosophy, a story of two distinct paths to understanding the world, each profoundly shaped by the culture that produced it. Where the Crusader mapmaker's gaze was often narrowed by immediate necessity, the next military campaign, the next pilgrim's route, the Islamic scholar's vision was expansively global, seeking to synthesize all of creation into a single, mathematically ordered system. This fundamental difference in purpose is what makes placing a detailed Crusader chart of the Levant next to Al-Idrisi's magnificent tabula Rogeriana such a revelatory experience. One feels like a tactical briefing, the other a universal encyclopedia. The Islamic cartographic tradition, building upon the knowledge of Greek, Persian, and Indian scholars, was driven by a pursuit of universal knowledge, or ilm, within the prosperous and intellectually vibrant Dar al-Islam. This environment fostered a commitment to mathematical rigor and a truly global perspective that was largely absent in Europe at the time. The crowning achievement of this approach is undoubtedly the work of the 12th century geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi. Commissioned by the Norman King Roger II of Sicily, a fascinating crossroads of cultures himself, Al-Idrisi spent 15 years synthesizing the work of earlier geographers with new reports from a network of travelers and his own observations. The result was the Tabula Rogeriana, a massive world map and accompanying text, the Kitab Rujar. This was not a map designed to guide a specific army, but to comprehend the entire known world. It divided the world into 70 sections, each described in meticulous detail, and presented the Earth as a sphere, drawing on classical knowledge that had been preserved and advanced in the Islamic world while it was often forgotten in the West. Its coordinate system and balanced representation of continents from Europe to Africa to Asia demonstrated a scientific detachment and a hunger for comprehensive understanding that was its primary motive. Crusader maps, by stark contrast, were instruments of strategy and survival. Their beauty and precision were almost always in service of a concrete, immediate objective. They excel in their hyper-focused, regional detail, the exact width of a mountain pass outside Antioch, the depth of a harbor at Acre, the seasonal flow of streams in the Judean desert. Every line and notation served a practical purpose for a user who was either at war or on a perilous religious journey. This focus is why their maps often feel so immersive and actionable for the specific region they cover. They are the product of intense, localized pressure. You can almost feel the dust of the road and the tension of potential ambush in their dense annotations. However, this incredible regional accuracy often came at the expense of a wider global context. Areas beyond the immediate sphere of Crusader interest might be condensed, distorted, or populated with mythical creatures, reflecting a reliance on outdated classical sources or pure speculation for the distant unknown. Their maps were brilliant, but they were also brilliant fragments. This divergence was not a matter of one being superior to the other, but a clear reflection of their cultural priorities. The Islamic world, connected by vast trade networks from Spain to Indonesia and united by the Arabic language of scholarship, was naturally inclined toward a global, encyclopedic view. Mapping was part of a broader scientific endeavor to order the cosmos. The Crusader states, however, were fragile, besieged outposts. Their cartography was a science born of siege, a discipline of defense and logistics. Their priority was not to map the whole world, but to secure and navigate their small, precious, and violently contested corner of it. This crucial difference in context determined everything from the tools they favored to the very way they conceived of space on the parchment. Yet, for all their differences, these traditions did not develop in a vacuum. They existed in a state of constant, if often indirect, conversation and mutual influence. This is the most exciting part of the story. Crusader mapmakers operating in the Levant, whether they admitted it or not, had access to the superior astronomical data and geographic coordinate systems developed by Islamic scholars. They adapted these tools for their own purposes, using Arabic celestial tables to refine their own navigational calculations. The Portolan chart, with its web of room lines and compass roses so vital to Mediterranean navigation, is itself a product of this cultural fusion, likely developed in the trading hubs of the Muslim and Christian Mediterranean. Conversely, the detailed regional knowledge gathered by Crusader surveyors and incorporated into their maps undoubtedly filtered back into the broader pool of geographic knowledge, perhaps even finding its way into later Islamic revisions. They were rivals and at times enemies, but intellectually they were collaborators in a single grand project of unlocking the secrets of the world, each contributing their unique piece to the puzzle. By appreciating both traditions, we gain a far richer, more complete understanding of medieval mapping, a field not of isolated genius but of collective, if competitive, advancement. Yet for all their practical utility and strategic importance, the vast majority of these magnificent Crusader maps did not survive the tumultuous centuries that followed the collapse of their kingdoms. They were lost to the relentless damp of European monasteries, consumed by library fires, or simply discarded as outdated curiosities as the age of exploration ushered in newer, more global charts. The precious few that endured did so through a combination of sheer luck and deliberate, often anonymous, acts of preservation. Many of the most famous examples we study today owe their existence to the meticulous, devout work of monastic scribes. In scriptoriums far from the Levant, in places like Canterbury or Monte Cassino, monks who would never set foot in the Holy Land recognized the spiritual and historical value of these documents. They carefully unrolled crumbling originals and painstakingly copied every line, every annotation, and every splash of color onto fresh parchment, effectively creating a new generation of the map. This process of copying was not mindless replication, it was an act of curation. A scribe might subtly correct a perceived error, add a new note based on a recent traveler's account, or even incorporate a fresh stylistic flourish, meaning each copy is a unique snapshot of geographical knowledge as it passed through time. The physical environment itself played a starring role in this story of survival. The dry, stable climate of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East acted as a natural preservative for parchment and ink. While a map stored in a damp French chateau might succumb to mold and rot within a few generations, a similar chart kept in a desert monastery or a sealed chest in Cairo could remain in near-perfect condition for centuries. This is why some of the most complete and stunning Crusader-era maps, or their Islamic contemporaries, were rediscovered not in Europe, but in libraries in Istanbul, Jerusalem, or Damascus. They had been safeguarded by the very cultures the Crusaders had sought to conquer, often valued as scientific works rather than strategic documents. For centuries, these treasures lay undisturbed in vast, dusty archives, waiting for a new generation of scholars to appreciate their significance. Their modern rediscovery began in earnest during the great age of antiquarianism in the 18th and 19th centuries. European collectors and scholars, scouring the old libraries of the world for classical texts, began to stumble upon these forgotten cartographic masterpieces. They were often misidentified or misunderstood, sometimes cut up and sold as individual illuminated miniatures to wealthy collectors. But pioneering historians of cartography gradually began to piece together their true origin and immense value, recognizing them not as fanciful medieval art but as sophisticated instruments of science and power. The painstaking work of comparing different copies, tracing their lineages, and deciphering their annotations opened a window into the medieval mind, revealing a level of geographical sophistication that shattered old stereotypes of a flat Earth Europe mired in ignorance. Today, the work of preservation has entered a thrilling new phase, moving from the physical to the digital. Advanced multispectral imaging is now revolutionizing our understanding of these maps. By photographing a fragile parchment under different wavelengths of light, from ultraviolet to infrared, conservators can see beneath the surface in ways never before possible. They can uncover earlier drafts that were scraped away and written over, revealing the mapmaker's first thoughts and corrections. They can decipher annotations that have faded to near invisibility, reading the marginal notes of long-dead owners who added their own observations. Stains and water damage can be digitally removed, allowing the original vibrant colors and crisp lines to shine through once more. High-resolution scans allow scholars from around the world to study the most minute details of a map simultaneously, zooming in to examine the individual brushstrokes of an illuminator or the precise prick marks left by a compass rose, all without subjecting the fragile original to the stress of travel and handling. This digital resurrection does more than just restore, it reconnects. It allows a researcher in California to virtually unroll Matthew Paris's itinerary map on her screen, tracing the pilgrim's path with a clarity that would have been impossible even for the map's original creator. It enables a historian in London to compare the coastline on a Crusader portolan with a modern satellite image, measuring the astonishing accuracy of the medieval survey. These maps are no longer static artifacts locked away in climate-controlled vaults. They have become dynamic databases, each one a layered repository of historical, scientific, and artistic information waiting to be interrogated. This ongoing effort to preserve and rediscover is a powerful testament to the enduring value of these documents. It underscores a profound responsibility we have to safeguard this fragile paper and parchment heritage, not as relics of a forgotten past, but as living testaments to human curiosity and resilience. They remind us that every line drawn was a victory over the unknown, and that preserving that line is how we ensure that victory is never forgotten. It's time to shatter some of the most persistent and misleading myths about medieval mapmaking, because the popular image of a cartographer hunched over a parchment, doodling sea monsters around the edges of a flat Earth, is a gross caricature that does a tremendous disservice to their genius. The first and perhaps most damaging misconception is that these maps were hopelessly inaccurate, little more than fanciful illustrations. Nothing could be further from the truth. When we actually analyze Crusader maps of the Levant, comparing their coastlines to satellite imagery or measuring the distances between cities they plotted, we find a level of precision that is frankly astonishing given their tools. Their renderings of the Mediterranean coastline, for instance, are often recognizable to the modern eye, with bays, headlands, and islands placed with a careful, calculated intentionality. The errors that do exist are usually minor and understandable. A mountain range might be slightly out of position, or a river's course might be simplified, but they are far from the wild, ignorant guesses of a lost and confused culture. These were not maps of fantasy. They were functional, reliable tools upon which lives and fortunes literally depended. To dismiss them as primitive art is to ignore the complex mathematical scaffolding, the geometry, the trigonometry, the celestial observations that supported every line. This leads directly to the second great myth, the lonely, isolated genius. We often imagine these figures as hermits working in solitary silence, cut off from the world. The reality was the polar opposite. Crusader cartographers were nodes in a vast, vibrant, and surprisingly global network of knowledge exchange. Their work was fundamentally collaborative, a tapestry woven from threads gathered across cultures and continents. They were not just talking to each other, they were actively engaging with the advanced scientific traditions of the very Islamic world they were in conflict with. In the scriptoriums of Antioch or Acre, a Christian monk might be meticulously copying an astronomical table originally compiled in Arabic, using data from Persian observatories to calibrate his astrolabe. He might be consulting a geographic treatise by a Muslim scholar that described the flow of the Nile in far greater detail than any European source could provide. This wasn't theft, it was respectful, necessary synthesis. They recognized superior knowledge when they saw it and had the intellectual humility and practical urgency to adopt it. This cross-cultural conversation was the engine of their innovation, proving that the pursuit of understanding has often flourished even amidst the chaos of war and political rivalry. Another stubborn falsehood is the belief that these maps were cluttered with monsters because their creators were superstitious and ignorant. While yes, you will find a "here be dragons" or a bizarre creature in the margins of some world maps, their presence is deeply misunderstood. On the detailed, practical regional charts used for actual navigation and military campaigning, the ones made by Crusader cartographers, these fantastical elements are almost entirely absent. They appear primarily on larger, more symbolic world maps which served a different purpose. These creatures were not necessarily literal beliefs. They were often standard cartographic symbols, a kind of visual shorthand. A sea serpent might indicate a region of treacherous, poorly understood currents, not an actual belief in a beast waiting to devour ships. A drawing of a strange race of men with large ears might simply denote a distant land whose people were unknown and therefore imaginatively depicted. They were filling the blanks of the unknown with the language of the fantastic, a tradition inherited from classical authors like Pliny the Elder, not an indication that they thought the world was flat or overrun by monsters. For the practical mapmaker in the field, the real monsters were dehydration, bandits, and getting lost, dangers his precise map was explicitly designed to avoid. By clinging to these simplistic myths, we do more than just get the history wrong. We actively erase one of the most fascinating stories of human ingenuity. We rob these men of the immense credit they deserve for laying the groundwork for the entire age of exploration that would follow. Their work was not a dead end of superstition but a vital bridge, a bridge that connected the classical knowledge of Greece and Rome with the scientific advancements of the Islamic Golden Age, and then carried that synthesized understanding forward into the Renaissance. When we dismiss the entire medieval period as a dark age, we blind ourselves to the brilliant flashes of light that were these maps, beacons of reason and empiricism in a complex world. Appreciating their true achievement requires a more nuanced view, one that sees them not as primitive ancestors to later cartographers, but as sophisticated professionals in their own right, whose work remains a breathtaking testament to what the human mind can accomplish with limited tools, boundless curiosity, and the courage to venture into the unknown, both on the land and in the realm of ideas. But the story of these maps is far from finished. In fact, we are standing at the brink of a new golden age of discovery, one powered not by astrolabes and parchment, but by artificial intelligence and hypersensitive spectral imaging. The same spirit of relentless inquiry that drove those medieval mapmakers now fuels teams of computer scientists and art historians who are using 21st century tools to peer deeper into these ancient documents than ever before, uncovering secrets the original creators may have never intended for anyone to see. Imagine being able to detect the faintest trace of a cartographer's first draft, a line he carefully scraped away and corrected centuries ago. That is now possible with multispectral imaging, a process that captures photographs of a map under different wavelengths of light, from ultraviolet to infrared. Each wavelength reveals a different layer of the artifact. What appears to the naked eye as a blank margin might, under infrared light, glow with the ghost of a hastily scribbled note or a preliminary sketch, giving us a direct window into the mapmaker's thought process and the revisions made in the heat of creation. This technological archaeology extends to the very materials that make up the map. Using portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometers, researchers can now non-invasively analyze the chemical composition of the inks and pigments on a parchment. This is far more than just academic curiosity. It is a powerful detective tool. The unique chemical signature of an ink can often be traced to a specific geographical source, a particular iron gall recipe common in a certain region, or a lapis lazuli blue that could only have come from a specific mine in Afghanistan. By mapping these material fingerprints, scholars can begin to answer profound questions about the map's origin and journey. Did the blue pigment on a map drawn in Acre actually come from Afghanistan, proving the existence of long-distance trade routes for art supplies? Does the ink on two different maps share an identical chemical makeup, suggesting they were produced in the same workshop, perhaps even by the same hand? This forensic analysis transforms the map from a simple image into a material witness to its own history, telling a story of economic networks, artistic recipes, and the movement of knowledge across continents. Perhaps the most transformative tool entering the field is artificial intelligence. Trained on thousands of digitized maps, machine learning algorithms are now being taught to recognize the subtle, almost imperceptible styles of individual cartographers, the specific way one might draw a mountain range or the distinctive curvature of a coastline. This allows computers to act as superhuman art historians, scanning through vast digital archives to find maps that share stylistic similarities, potentially identifying the unknown work of a master mapmaker or tracing the influence of one workshop on another. AI can also be set to the task of pattern recognition on a massive scale, comparing hundreds of maps to track the evolution of a single geographic myth, like the location of the mythical kingdom of Prester John, watching as it shifts and moves across generations of parchment based on new reports and wild speculation. This ability to process visual information at a scale and speed impossible for any human researcher is opening up entirely new avenues for understanding the interconnected web of medieval cartography. The ultimate application of this technology is not just analysis but resurrection. Using the precise data extracted from these maps, the coordinates, the elevations, the annotated distances, teams are now creating breathtakingly immersive virtual reality recreations of the journeys they depict. You can now put on a headset and find yourself standing on the deck of a Crusader ship, watching the digitally rendered coastline of the Levant rise from the sea exactly as it would have appeared to a knight arriving from Europe. You can then follow the mapped route inland, walking the virtual path through the same mountain passes and across the same deserts, experiencing the sheer scale of the distance and the challenge of the terrain in a way that a flat parchment can never convey. These immersive experiences are powerful educational tools, transforming abstract historical facts into tangible, emotional understanding. They allow us to quite literally walk in the footsteps of those pilgrims and soldiers, gaining a profound appreciation for the accuracy of the maps that guided them and the monumental achievement of the minds who drew them. This forward-looking perspective fundamentally changes our relationship with these historical artifacts. They are no longer static, fossilized records of a closed past. Instead, they are dynamic, living databases, each one holding layers of information we are only just learning how to access. Every new technological advance offers a new lens through which to view them, promising discoveries that could further illuminate the mathematical brilliance and the human story of the Crusader mapmakers. The patient, precise work of these medieval scholars ensured their maps would guide travelers through space. Now, with the help of artificial intelligence and advanced imaging, those same maps are guiding us through time, revealing their secrets one pixel, one chemical signature, and one algorithm at a time. As our exploration of these visionary mapmakers comes to a close, it's worth reflecting on the extraordinary synthesis they achieved, a fusion of celestial observation, sacred geometry, and raw human courage that turned the terrifying void of the unknown into a structured, navigable reality. Their work was far more than lines on parchment. It was a profound act of translation, converting the silent language of the stars and the subtle contours of the earth into a guide that could lead an army through a mountain pass or a pilgrim to a holy site. This wasn't just a technical skill. It was a form of alchemy, transforming anxiety into assurance and speculation into strategy. The legacy they forged extends far beyond the dusty charts in museum archives, echoing in the very principles that guide our modern world, from the satellite networks that power our GPS to the geographic information systems that shape our cities. Their story is a powerful testament to the idea that human curiosity, when paired with rigorous method, can illuminate even the darkest corners of the map. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from their endeavors is the timeless value of intellectual humility and cross-cultural collaboration. These scholars, often working on the front lines of conflict, possess the wisdom to recognize that superior knowledge could come from anywhere, even from the very cultures they were fighting. By embracing the astronomical tables of Persian scholars and the geographic wisdom of Arab savants, they didn't weaken their own work, they immeasurably enriched it. This willingness to listen, to learn, and to synthesize diverse traditions is a model for our own increasingly interconnected world, reminding us that the pursuit of understanding transcends political and religious divides. Their maps stand as silent monuments to the power of shared knowledge, proving that the most accurate picture of our world is always built from many different perspectives. Let the story of the Crusader cartographers inspire a fresh sense of wonder for the tools we often take for granted. The next time you glance at the blinking blue dot on your phone, guiding you effortlessly to your destination, remember the centuries of innovation, struggle, and dedication that made such precision possible. That simple digital map is the direct descendant of an astrolabe sighting on a windy hilltop and a monk's careful transcription of a traveler's tale. Every time we navigate with confidence, we are benefiting from a legacy of human ingenuity that stretches back to those first courageous attempts to chart the unknown. Their journey encourages us to approach our own world with the same blend of curiosity and rigor, to look beyond the surface of the everyday and appreciate the deep, hidden histories that shape our lives. If this journey into the minds of medieval mapmakers has sparked your imagination, we would love to hear which part of their story you found most fascinating. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did their mathematical brilliance, their daring expeditions, or their cultural exchanges capture your interest the most? For more deep dives into the forgotten innovations of history, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure into the past. Thank you for joining us on this remarkable expedition. Until our paths cross again on the next map of history, never stop seeking out the extraordinary stories hidden in plain sight. Keep exploring.